Yes, recording started.
Okay, our presentation will begin shortly, and this session is being recorded. All of the attendees are muted. And there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, so put your questions there, and we'll probably wait and address the questions at the end of the session. Next slide. So welcome everyone. We have some upcoming events in our series. On November 17th, we'll have the CALGreen non-residential code, and on December 8th, we'll cover indoor air quality. So this is the second webinar in the City of Chula Vista Development Services Department Energy Efficiency and Green Building Seminar Series. For 2020, we've moved the series online, and this series is being recorded. Today, we're here virtually with staff and the community to review the 2019 California Green Building Standards Code that took effect January 1st, 2020. We have two terrific presenters here today, Colleen Fitzsimmons and Doug Kopp, and they'll walk you through the CALGreen Code for residential construction with an emphasis on how it's being applied to meet Chula Vista's sustainability goals. So please put your questions in the Q&A area, and Colleen, I think we'll start us off.
Great, thanks for the intro, Lynn, and welcome everybody to today's talk about building codes. Yay! We're going to specifically be talking about CALGreen's 2019 residential code and measures. Please go to the next slide. The topics that we'll be covering is a little bit of CALGreen history and the California Building Code, CALGreen's mandatory residential measures, CALGreen's voluntary residential measures, which provide a leadership standard within the code, and an opportunity to go above minimum requirements and often become the basis for advanced local ordinances. The voluntary measures are referred to as tiers 1 and 2, with tier 2 indicating the most advanced option. You'll also see two icons here and throughout the presentation. The 3-level triangle icon indicates where mandatory measures have a tier 1 or tier 2 voluntary measure associated with them. And where Chula Vista's green building ordinances are in alignment with CALGreen, you'll see the Chula Vista icon. Next, please. So looking at the bottom half of this time frame, I'm just going to talk about CALGreen's history, which officially started around 2004, when an executive order created the Green Building Action Team. And spurred on by California's landmark initiative AB 32, which established a goal of reducing greenhouse gases to 1990 levels by 2020, we created our first Green Building Code in 2008. This was a voluntary code, but created a pathway for the mandatory code that followed in 2010. And the content in that was developed from LEAD, the Collaborative for High Performance Schools, Build It Green and its Greenpoint rated program, and ASHRAE 189, which was a draft standard. Every 3 years, we go through an upgrade process. From the 2010, we moved to the 2013, which you can see on the timeline. I think the 2010 is mismarked. So, it's a little confusing, but so every 3 years we go through this update process where changes are proposed and go through public review, and then after adoption become effective January 1st of the following year. So the 2013 code became effective 2014, etc. In between the triennial code adoption, we publish amendments and errata and begin our process to formalize the intervening code supplement, which comes every 1.5 years, which we've just completed for this code cycle, actually, and which should go into effect July 1st, 2021. And subsequently, each code cycle has gotten us further along the way to ensure we can meet the greenhouse gas reduction goal that spurred us to begin with. Next, please. So there are 12 parts defined for the California Building Standards Code, which is Title 24. Today we'll be looking at Part 11, the California Green Building Standards Code, otherwise known as CALGreen. CALGreen interacts with the 10 other parts, and they are meant to work together. You can see that within CALGreen itself, where there's references to the plumbing code, the energy code, and other parts of the building code.
Yeah, Colleen, if I could add, sometimes we refer to Title 24 and as like colloquially as just meaning the energy code, but it is important to note that the entire building standards code, the California building codes are actually all Title 24, and the Part 6 that we refer to as Title 24 compliance, meaning energy, it really is the full suite of all of the codes that are Title 24. And so just in CalGreen is an equal part of as any of the other sections of the code that make up the Title 24 standards. So sorry, just wanted to add that in.
Thanks, Doug. No, I appreciate it. And if we could go to the next slide. So the point here is that CalGreen is not a standalone code. It comes as part of Title 24. It's enforced like other California codes. It's coordinated with other state and local municipal codes. It maintains the current relationship between enforcing agencies and builders. And most importantly, it establishes uniformity and consistency. Next, please. Thank you. So every code cycle, Chula Vista has adopted CalGreen for its green building standard. And we'll talk later about how Chula Vista has gone beyond CalGreen to include additional green building requirements. Next, please. And since 2013, Chula Vista has also included the Consultant Services Ordinance, stating that a consultant may be needed to evaluate your project and provide recommendations. And developers often do this to create commitment and assurance within the project, and it helps with the review process for sure. Next, please. So today we'll be covering these 6 sections, boxed in red. The first 4 chapters, and then Chapter 8 and Appendix A4 covering the voluntary tiers. Next, please. So to kick us off with Chapter 1, this is administration. Our building codes are created and enforced with the purpose of improving public health, safety, and general welfare. And this holds true as well with CalGreen. This chapter confirms all CalGreen requirements and must be reflected in the construction documents. And it confirms that documentation is required. And we'll note that in this conversation today, so you can see what that looks like or what that might mean. We will see some compliance forms and checklists at the end of this presentation that can be used to ease the review process. Next, please. The purpose of CalGreen goes beyond health and safety to reinforce sustainable building practices and breaks them down into these 5 areas. And we'll see this in more detail when we get to Chapter 4, where we separate the measures into these 5 categories. Next, please. So on to Chapter 2, which lists our definitions. In every code cycle, they add terms to reflect the advancements in green building technologies. And I've noted the new ones for this code cycle on the slide. And this helps us define these technologies so we have some common language around green building. And this also creates a clear path around enforceability, consistency in application, and coordination with other codes. Vagueness can create risk and makes everyone's job difficult. So the reason we have this chapter is for consistency, clarity, and certainty. Next, please. Chapter 3, Green Building, clarifies the different project types and how this code gets applied to each. Mixed-use projects, alterations and additions, low and high-rise residential are all addressed here. However, the local planning authority will make any final interpretation if there's any question about applicability. Next, please. So this takes us to Chapter 4, the meat of this presentation, where we'll look at the residential mandatory measures, as I mentioned earlier. And this chapter is separated into the 5 parts, which we'll go through shortly. And as we go through them, you'll see a dark blue bar at the bottom of the screen. This is where, you don't see it here, but this is where you'll see that we've included the code requirements for each section. We don't expect you to be able to read them during this presentation. However, we included them so that you can go back through the recording later and review them if you'd like. They do sometimes include more detail than what I may be saying in the presentation. Next, please. So section 4.1, planning and design, we look at environmentally responsible site selection, building design, building siting, and development. And we do this to protect, restore, and enhance the environmental quality of the site and respect the integrity of adjacent properties through planning to minimize negative effects. Next, please. Stormwater drainage and retention proactively addresses flooding of our buildings and the potential pollution of our oceans and waterways. So we first look at runoff during construction. So we can design and plan for proper stormwater drainage and retention. And this can be done using a number of different methods like retention basins, filtering barriers and straw rolls, sedimentation control, and silt fence. Next, please. Proper site design also prevents flooding and stormwater runoff using natural features such as water retention gardens or vegetated bioswales, similar to what's pictured on the left here. And other stormwater management methods such as French drains are also encouraged. These methods slow water runoff, giving the water a chance to infiltrate the soil and recharge groundwater sources, which is really important, especially during drought times, but also helps to filter the water and clean it for future use. Next, please. So the next section under site development is for electric vehicle charging in new construction. And we do this to promote the use of zero or low emitting vehicles. And so we have requirements for charging infrastructure. And by that, I mean raceways and properly sized electrical panels, particularly in 1 and 2 family dwellings. So you'll see the tiered triangle icon here that lets us know that there are voluntary measures that go beyond these requirements. Doug, do you want to tell us more about what other communities are doing?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of communities have used the tiers as it relates to electric vehicles to essentially adopt a REACH code. And so REACH code is a locally adopted and enforced code that goes above and beyond the base minimums. And this can be applied to any aspect of code development that we'll be talking about today, or other ordinances and regulations in your community. But the electric vehicle in particular has been a very popular REACH code option for a lot of communities in Northern California, where they're actually going kind of both above and beyond in terms of the quantity that's required, especially in multifamily units, and also upgrades for the infrastructure associated. So we'll touch on it a little bit in a couple of slides at the very end of the presentation, just to illustrate the tiers in CALGreen. But just know that in order to kind of even keep up with the market in Northern California for electric vehicles, cities and municipalities have decided that they wanted to push beyond the base level minimums of CALGreen as it relates to electric vehicle infrastructure and residential development. Now there's some provisions for how you approach it for accessory dwelling units. So there's some solutions that can be adopted locally utilizing the tiers within CALGreen to meet, again, local need without it necessarily overburdening or increasing the cost of construction.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So for multifamily buildings, the requirements include more infrastructure so that they are all ready for charging equipment to be installed. The reason we're pushing to get infrastructure included is that transportation is responsible for 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can make it easier for people to transition to cleaner vehicles, that helps us get to our goals, but also helps prevent air pollution caused by fossil fuels that impacts our health. In multifamily projects, this is especially important since they tend to be located in more densely populated areas that typically see more air pollution. And additionally, these requirements are important because individual tenants and unit owners cannot add this infrastructure themselves when they do decide they want to have an electric vehicle, at least not for faster charging purposes. Next, please. So multifamily buildings must make 10% of all parking EV spaces. Again, this means that they need to include the raceway, appropriate electrical panel capacity, and all underground components installed. And then you can see from this table that hotel or motel have a 10 parking space threshold that triggers the need for EV parking spaces calculated accordingly. Next, please. So this brings us to energy efficiency, section 4.2, and I will hand it over to Doug.
Great.
Next slide.
Thanks, Colleen. So, so far we've been talking about CALGreen as it relates to kind of the broad applications. There are layers of CALGreen that definitely tie back into other code sections, and energy efficiency is a perfect example of that. So in the development of the chapters of the Title 24 codes, the CALGreen is part 11, and part 6, as we mentioned earlier, is the energy piece. Now, a green building code must address energy efficiency, and in this instance, the mandatory measures of CALGreen are exactly that. They tie back into the minimum performance and minimum requirements associated with the energy code, or part 6 of Title 24 requirements. If we go to the next slide, there are mentions within CALGreen, especially when we get into the tiers, of using higher performance expectations for energy efficiency. And one of the things that was new in the 2016 version of the Energy Code, Part 6 of Title 24, and in CALGreen, was the use of something called the Energy Design Rating. And this is so how kind of CALGreen references the Energy Code is through performance associated with the Energy Design Rating. And there are two aspects of that performance. There is an efficiency score, and then there's also the efficiency score plus photovoltaic benefit. So there's sort of a building efficiency score, and then the final EDR. And you'll see these numbers referenced in CALGreen, especially when we get into the tiers, but it shows up a bunch in the Energy Code, and the mandatory measure here in CALGreen is basically minimum compliance with that Energy Code. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of the differences and additions that were brought into the 2019 code. So while these aren't required by CALGreen, they are referenced via the California Energy Code. And because we are talking about CALGreen and the green building aspects, there are some definite areas of overlap. For example, you may have seen that new residential buildings in California are basically required to have solar photovoltaic systems on them now. So that was a new code requirement as of really 2016, but 2019 actually set the threshold of the size of that PV system to be able to zero out the electricity use for residential construction. So that was a pretty big increase in expectations around solar photovoltaic systems. But other kind of related to CALGreen aspects address healthy indoor air quality. And so there are now new requirements in the Energy Code that tie directly back to some of the pieces we'll talk about on indoor air quality as it relates to green building approaches. Now, some other aspects around building envelope and performance that are improvements in the California Energy Code that also relate to CALGreen. I guess maybe what's interesting to note is the California Energy Code is written by the California Energy Commission, where the other aspects of the code of Title 24 are actually written by the California Building Standards Commission. And these two entities are expected to work kind of closely together on developing the content. The California Energy Code does have a cost effectiveness requirement, so there's nothing that can be put into the California Energy Code that is going to increase costs without having associated savings. And that's not exactly true for the other aspects of the code, which are focused on health, safety, and welfare. And so CALGreen, for example, has other provisions in it that aren't required to be cost effective, but are definitely there for the protection of California citizens and especially occupants of our buildings. So with that, I'll pass it back to Colleen to speak about water efficiency as we go to the next slide.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, so this is 4.3, water efficiency and conservation. And if you could go to the next slide, please. In a drought-prone region such as San Diego, where we import approximately 80% of our water, the environmental impact is intense. So not only in loss of potable water during transport, but the energy required to get it here. So this chapter covers conserving water used indoors, outdoors, and in wastewater conveyance. And it's important for all of us, and you'll see why when we get to some of the cost savings associated. Next, please. So we have efficiency standards for toilets, showers, bathroom and kitchen faucets. And those account for nearly 60% of our indoor water use, broken down in this chart. Next, please. Code requirements haven't changed much in the last code cycle. There was one change, but just going to kind of go through the highlights here. Toilets must use a maximum of 1.28 gallons per flush. Shower heads max out at 1.8 gallons per minute. Bathroom faucets have a max flow rate of 1.2 gallons per minute, and kitchen faucets have a maximum of 1.8 gallons per minute. Water bills in San Diego are more expensive than your gas and electric bills when they're counted separately. So any savings here really matters. And it's super easy to put an aerator on your faucet or install a new shower head to help you save water and money. Next, please. So then looking at our outdoor water use, we're here in San Diego, 60% of the county's outdoor water use is at our residences. And for the most part, we are using that same expensive potable drinking water for this. Next, please. So we're getting into the outdoor potable water used in landscape areas. And this is another example of CALGreen coordinating with codes and ordinances defined outside of Part 11 of Title 24. And this section reinforces the state's model water efficient landscape ordinance. And for projects less than 2,500 square feet of landscaping, there is an option to use MWELO's prescriptive compliance pathway. The model water efficient landscape ordinance is otherwise known as MWELO. Sorry if I didn't state that first. And so you'll note that there's a Chula Vista icon here in the upper right-hand corner. So go to the next slide, please. And that's because Chula Vista has a landscape water conservation ordinance as well, which reinforces the city's water conservation goals. And this ordinance parallels MWELO, so we're perfectly aligned between CALGreen and Chula Vista with the state's model water efficient landscape ordinance. Next, please. It gets us into the water reuse system section. And on-site water reuse systems are more fully addressed in the voluntary measures. You can see that again from our icon indicating that there's tier 1 and tier 2 options. This measure, however, says that if the local municipality is supplying tertiary recycled water, then you may be required to install recycled water supply systems, typically dual plumbing, etc. And as you can see from the Chula Vista icon up above, we have a related ordinance as well for laundry to landscape systems, which is based on one of the CALGreen voluntary measures that I mentioned. And Doug will talk more about this later. Next, please. So we're going to talk about material conservation and resource efficiency in this next section. Next, please. And just this week, Australia's National Science Agency said that 9.25 million to 15.87 million tons of microplastics are embedded in the seafloor. The amount of fragments embedded in the seafloor is far more than the plastic floating on the ocean surface, and we've all been shocked and appalled by how much is there. And specifically the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is 87,000 tons of trash alone. Scientists believe that 4.4 million to 8.8 million tons of plastic enter the sea every year. And that number is expected to triple to 29 million tons per year by 2040 without drastic changes. Next, please. The Chula Vista Nature Center highlights this issue with the Washed Ashore project, gathering trash that lands on our beaches. And all of this tells me that we must reduce or eliminate our use of plastic. And if that's not possible, then we need to recycle everything else. So CALGreen starts to address this in this section. Next, please. To conserve resources, we can make buildings more durable, which would reduce the time until it's demolished or rebuilt, and reduce waste throughout the construction process once it's determined that that's needed. Next, please. And one effort towards durability is to prevent rodents getting in the home. You must properly seal or install wire mesh in all openings in the exterior wall. This has an added benefit of being a non-chemical pest control solution, reducing poisons and pollutants inside the home as well. Next, please. Due to construction and demolition waste taking up 20% of our waste stream, CALGreen's making construction teams plan out how waste will be separated on site and recycled or salvaged, or taken to a facility that will process and divert reusable or recyclable materials. CALGreen requires that we must divert 65% of the construction and demolition waste away from the landfill. Additionally, there are voluntary measures aligned with this mandatory measure. Tier 1 has 75% diversion, or 100% of the waste is diverted to meet Tier 2, with additional requirements as well. Next, please. CALGreen requires the submittal of a construction waste management plan showing that how you intend to handle reusable and recyclable materials and the estimated amounts. Chula Vista has a waste management form on their website that you could use for this, or just use CALGreen. They provide one in Chapter 8 of the code. Next, please. Additional documentation requirements include hauler tags that show diversion rates and amounts of each waste stream if site separation is a method that's selected to meet the overall diversion rate requirement. Sometimes your mixed C&D diversion rate will not meet 65%, so you must do site separation on the job site to ensure you hit the 65% pull requirement. Next, please. As California's building code gets more advanced, especially as the energy code requires our buildings to be higher performing, we end up relying on the proper functioning of our building systems, such as the HVAC, irrigation, appliances, and utilities. And as these technologies advance, it's important that those living in the buildings understand how the building operates and understand how to maintain it. Because without proper maintenance, our high efficiency systems cannot perform as intended and can often cost money because of those inefficiencies. So CALGreen requires an operations and maintenance manual to be provided. And if you would like a template to use on your project, you can get one from the Chula Vista website or get from CALGreen's website. Next slide. Lastly, for multifamily buildings, there must be readily accessible areas to collect and store recyclable materials for pickup, and that includes organic waste here in the 2019 code cycle. To combat our overwhelming plastic and other trash issues, we must encourage recycling wherever we can. And this can sometimes be hard in multifamily projects where the residents or unit owners don't have contracts for garbage hauling and rely on the building itself. And so therefore, code puts that requirement on multifamily buildings for them. Next, please. So in the last section, we have environmental quality. Next, please. And really, all you need to see is dangerous black mold and a cute baby to know that you don't want these two things anywhere near each other. And why is that? Because we know mold can cause respiratory illnesses. And we also know that other harmful chemicals and pollutants can cause health issues as well. Research shows that building-related symptoms are associated with building characteristics, including dampness, cleanliness, and ventilation. And CALGreen attempts to address these issues in this section. Next, please. So since we spend 90% of our time indoors, feels like more these days, where the concentrations of some pollutants are often 2 to 5 times higher than typical outdoor concentrations. Clearly not during wildfires or naval vessel fires, but still that statistic's pretty horrifying. But there are some things that we can do. Next, please. Due to the dangerous gases and air pollution from fireplaces, CALGreen requires that installed gas fireplaces must be direct vent, sealed combustion type. That ensures that none of the inside air is used to is involved in the combustion of the gas and prevents any backdraft into the home. Next slide. Now we're going to look at covering duct openings. And during construction, debris and dust is often blown around and can get into HVAC equipment. So to prevent that and then the eventual discharge of that dust and debris back into the operating home, all duct openings must be sealed until final startup when the systems are ready for operation. Next, please. Now we're going to look at paints, sealants, caulks, and adhesives, which can off-gas volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, for many months after application. CALGreen places limits on the VOC content for these materials depending on their type and its use. Most paints can be easily found with no VOCs or low VOC these days, so there's really no reason to poison your home or your client's home with these chemicals. Next, please. Another easily available material is carpet with low or no VOC off-gassing. There are third-party nonprofits that have created testing standards with VOC limits that help us identify these carpets. This is a priority. So when California wanted to include limits for this, they didn't have to create a standard. It was already there. CALGreen just recognizes and accepts compliance by if you select a carpet that meets the requirements for CRA's Green Label Plus program or 3 other standards widely available. CALGreen compliance also requires the use of low VOC carpet pads and cushions, and this can, and as well as adhesive. So this can be easy to miss, and so I bring that to your attention here. Next, please. Similarly, there are a number of recognized industry standards for resilient flooring. And again, California didn't need to look any further than existing marketplace, which makes finding appropriate flooring easy. The accepted standards include UL's Green Guard, RFCI's Floor Score, and 2 more. So there's plenty of options available. Wood flooring that has been certified has the added benefit of reduced formaldehyde off-gassing, which in high concentrations can cause cancer and has adverse health effects in lower concentrations that may be found during typical off-gassing. This measure requires that at least 80% of resilient flooring meets one of the standards. However, as you can see, we've got our tiered icon again. There are options for more stringent compliance in the voluntary measures. Next, please. For composite wood products such as hardwood plywood, particle board, and MDF, CALGreen has requirements for formaldehyde emissions, as you can see in this table. This aligns exactly with the California Air Resources Board, also called CARB's, Phase 2 requirements. And interestingly enough, federal standards restricting formaldehyde in these same materials have come into effect this last year, 2019, that are exactly the same as CARB and CALGreen. So we've basically set the standard for the country, as we have in other efficiency measures as well. So again, documentation is required to show compliance through spec sheets, chain of custody indicated on an invoice, or product labeling. Technically, you'd think that this shouldn't be hard to find since non-compliant composite wood is generally not legal now anywhere in the US, but tracking down documentation is still required and sometimes can be challenging. So wanted to make sure that's on your radar as well. Next, please. Another method to prevent moisture moving up from the ground into the home is a capillary break which is required to install under concrete slabs and framing. Next, please. Building materials must be stored to prevent moisture damage, and you cannot use materials that have water damage or closed walls or floors without determining the moisture readings inside. Using a meter, kind of like the one here in our image, you have to show that compliant moisture content is below 19% in a number of different random readings. Next, please. To help with moisture control as well as ventilation, bathrooms must all have Energy Star exhaust fans with humidity controls. The bathroom fan must be part of a whole house ventilation system. Oh, if the bathroom fan is part of a whole house ventilation system, then humidity controls are not required. because typically they'd be running continuously. Whole house ventilation ensures fresh air is moving throughout the house, which improves overall air quality, which hopefully we've seen is important in this section. Next, please. And lastly, CALGreen requires that HVAC systems are sized, ducts are sized, and layouts are designed, and equipment appropriately selected based on the load calculations, following the methods of ACA manuals J, D, and S, or similar calculations. So correctly sizing and designing your system allows it to work more efficiently, so you save money. And so don't let your installer tell you they don't need to use the calcs, because A, it's required, and B, efficient systems are to your benefit. Next, please. So now I'm going to hand it over to Doug again, and he'll take us through compliance forms and CALGreen voluntary measures, as well as Chula Vista.
Thanks, Colleen.
Thanks.
Yeah, so the next couple of slides, we're going to look at sort of taking all the content that Colleen has just described and work through actually how a project would document and submit and what that process of review and approval would look like. So as we kind of mentioned throughout, there are the mandatory requirements, and then there are the tiered options. And supporting each of those is a set of compliance forms, worksheets, and a reference manual, all of which are freely available. Chula Vista maintains a number of forms, as Colleen mentioned, on things like the waste management. Other forms are available through HCD, or Housing and Community Development, who manage this CALGreen for residential projects in California. And these forms are actually required for completion of tax credit allocations on affordable housing projects, for example. So these should be known to project teams and really should be known to city staff who are doing review. But just know that there are a set of resources out there. If we go to the next slide, jurisdictions do have sometimes their own way that they like to see things recorded. Chula Vista tends to rely on a set of forms produced by the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, and they have what are called their green building standards or green building sheets. And so it offers an opportunity to kind of basically show alignment of your building plans. These get inserted into the set of drawings. And they incorporate in any kind of local sustainability ordinances. Now for Chula Vista, there's one in particular that we'll speak to in a little bit, but generally the standard forms will work, and you can use anything you'd like, but the AIA forms are a really great way to kind of get this incorporated into your drawing set, showing that consistency, completeness, and compliance with the codes as we go through. Next slide, please. So there are some specific sheets, these green sheets that the City of Chula Vista has as well, that also show kind of basically a compliance opportunity and how you would do this to reference your drawing set back to the requirements of CALGreen. Now, this particular example, which may be hard to see on your screen, does show the requirements that Colleen just described, and then you would reference kind of where in the drawing set it is, and then use this to track comments for the review process. So very helpful for city staff and for design teams to kind of show compliance and track attainment of the CALGreen requirements. So next slide, please. We've talked a little bit about the sort of forms. There is also an aspect of this that ties into final inspections as well. So Chula Vista maintains a permit and documentation procedure for multifamily dwellings, is this particular form. And you'll see that there's this requirements or documents for final inspection. And I zoomed in on that to show that there is actually a checklist for energy code and green building codes. So those are the green sheets we just looked at that tie back into field inspection. And then even though it's not CALGreen exactly, the Title 24 energy code and documentation do relate very carefully to the CALGreen requirements. So these are expected processes in the inspection as we go through and inspect and make residential buildings available for occupancy, that there is a final sign-off that happens on the CALGreen related work. Next slide, please. We've talked a little bit about tier 1 and tier 2 so far, but I just want to spend another maybe couple of minutes just kind of talking through this. So the tier 1 and tier 2 approach within CALGreen are essentially a way of putting a leadership standard into a building code. If a code is the floor and we have green building rating systems or leadership standards that go above the minimum requirements of a code, that's what we have is with tier 1 and tier 2. And they are voluntary packages that are above the minimum green practices. In order to kind of achieve a tier, you would do all of the mandatory measures that Colleen's described in CalGreen, plus additional required practices, as well as then also take on a number of optional kind of credits. So this is where the code sort of starts to feel a little bit like a green building rating system, like the Green Point rated system or a LEED for homes or something along those lines that you may be familiar with. But there's an opportunity for cities to actually be using tiers as a means to pass a locally more stringent code. This is, we'll talk about the laundry to landscape in a moment, but a lot of communities are using this for electric vehicles, as we've mentioned. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show it maybe a little bit of an example of kind of what's expected in the tier 1. So the image on the right portion of the screen is that checklist on tier 1 compliance. And we sort of, when we look at tier 1 for electric vehicles, for example, in multifamily housing, we go from 10% of spaces to 15% of spaces. And we also move from EV capable to EV ready, where before we just needed the empty conduit and space in our panel. We now need to install the actual the circuit to the location. So, and then there's another level which is EV, where you're doing the full installation of the EV service equipment, where it's installed. And so a lot of communities are moving all the way from EV capable, which is the minimum CalGreen requirement, to EV chargers installed fully for single family homes and also for multifamily homes as well. So requiring additional electric vehicle infrastructure. Now, there was a question that was asked earlier around what can be done for existing construction. And honestly, the best thing for future existing construction is to be looking at this as an opportunity to put in reach codes now to reduce the future cost of retrofit down the road. But there's not a ton of code measures that address existing infrastructure other than standard electric codes and the sign-offs and inspections associated with that. But in terms of incentives and support for this, local utilities, in other parts of the state, there are significant incentives to do electric vehicle infrastructure upgrades for residents in particular. You know, thousands of dollars to handle your panel upgrade, your electrical work, your charging infrastructure itself, even help purchase an electric vehicle. That's not necessarily what we are dealing with in San Diego County or in Chula Vista specifically, but we expect those incentives to continue to be pretty robust in the future. But for now, I did put a link in the Q&A on the SDG&E incentives around electric vehicles. So if we go to the next slide. Kind of an example of how the tiers work. This is a different checklist. And you're welcome to use whatever you'd like when you're going through this, but this highlights the difference between the mandatory requirements, the tier 1 prerequisites, and then the electives that one could choose. And this is focusing in on energy. So to kind of tie back that CalGreen to the energy code again. You'll see that the way CalGreen references its mandatory minimum requirements for energy is just to meet the code energy efficiency standard in part 6. Now, part 11, CalGreen, tiers off of that and says you've got to actually also reduce your outdoor lighting power by 90%, and then also address service water heating if you're a restaurant. And then you look at kind of an energy budget associated with an increased energy performance tied to your calculated minimum compliance. And then there's some electives you would choose from where you would be looking at on-site renewable energy with documentation. And then for different kinds of buildings, there's other examples of ways you would approach the electives that would go with that. So a project could choose to be a tier 1, CalGreen tier 1 project. And that would be, you know, kind of equivalent of saying that you are a, you know, certified green building above and beyond the code minimums, for example. So let's go to the next slide. we'll wrap up the slides and open up for Q&A. And let's actually, the next image covers this as well. It's something we've looked at already, but let's go to the next slide. So there's quite a bit of history for Chula Vista as it relates to green building. In fact, in many ways, Chula Vista has led the state. In the 80s, there was the creation of a Resource Conservation Commission that actually led to a kind of very early CO2 action plan and growth management elements in the general plan, which kind of came into the general plan in the 1989 version. These became parts of the ordinances and codes by the early 90s. Moving ahead, there was at some point as CALGreen was moving from being a concept in 2004 to being codified, even just a voluntary standard in 2008. Chula Vista was actually carefully looking at the possibility of creating its own standard around green buildings, or using a third-party standard like the USGBC LEED or Greenpoint rated for residential. So the interesting thing is, at the time, the Chula Vista kind of was really pushing on energy efficiency, pushing on photovoltaic pre-wiring, a lot of the things that became standard elements in CALGreen. So as we mentioned before, there are whole areas where California has led the nation, and there are actually, periods of time where Chula Vista was leading the state. So really exciting kind of legacy to build from here, and kind of transitioning this timeline out. There was a period of time where Chula Vista had done a kind of an interesting reach code looking at land use components as a functional equivalent for emissions. And that was in the 2013 through through the 2016 code cycle, through the adoption of something called the Climate Neighbor, which was essentially an energy reach code, or related to an energy reach code. And that is a precursor for how the state is looking at future codes and where the code development is going now, where it's going to be focusing on emissions reduction rather than just even energy use, or even some of the green building elements you've heard discussed today are going to be tied back significantly into emissions, embodied emissions and operational emissions associated with buildings. So really great legacy to build from here. Let's go to the next slide, which is a little bit of a highlight from 2012. This was, kind of talking about the history of the Title 24 and green building approaches to Chula Vista, and being recognized as a distinguished leader by local governments around energy efficiency, green building, and other sustainable planning principles, really into every aspect of development, design review, project approval, and construction inspection process. Let's go next slide. And so let's talk a little bit about the one aspect of the current ordinances that do address kind of a tiered approach, or above and beyond. So Chula Vista requires that all new detached single-family dwellings and duplexes shall include a single source clothes washer gray water outlet. So basically you have to come off of your laundry and you go into your landscape irrigation, and it's got to be aligned to the plumbing code and other aspects of the codes. But this is a requirement to have the gray water stub out for all single family and duplex projects in Chula Vista. So an area where Chula Vista is still kind of ahead of the CALGreen. This aligns to the tiers that are present in CALGreen. So an example of still ongoing leadership for Chula Vista. And that aligns, of course, to the water goals of the state and local as well. So I think with that, let's wrap it up and take to the next slide for any Q&A. It looks like there's a few questions in the chat box. So great, let me see if I can catch up with what's there. Let's see, I see heat pump water heaters are very efficient, use electricity, and work well with the PV system. Are there measures to promote heat pump water heaters over inefficient gas water heaters? I'm happy to answer that one. John, there are efforts happening at the state level around this and elsewhere throughout California. In Northern California, a number of communities have passed REACH codes aimed at just this aspect because of both the efficiency but also the emissions associated with the kind of conversion of heat pumps and photovoltaics or clean energy. So we're a little bit slower in San Diego and SDG&E territory, but a lot of conversations are happening now. There is actually a statewide effort looking at the 2022 code update to consider moving some of this equipment over as well. So we're a little slower in San Diego than elsewhere in the state, but lots happening around the use of heat pump water heaters. I myself have a hot heat pump water heater. Love it. It's a really great not to have combustion equipment in my home. So I'm very happy to operate that, and happy to share my story with it as well. So it looks like there's some other questions there too. So let's see. Tied to gray water. Oh, sorry. Are there measures for landscaping and design to support native plants, pollinating insects, and native animals important to the local ecosystem? Colleen, do you want to take that, or I'm happy to keep going
Yeah,
there?
that's not directly included in the mandatory or the tiered measures. Although to meet the requirements of MWEL, you need to really take advantage of the low water requirements of native plants. However, you would have to go to a third party system to get guidance around pollinating insects and native animals that support native animals and plants that support native animals. So yeah, those as a concept, those are not directly addressed, although certainly to meet MWEL, you need to get really a good understanding of our native plants.
Yeah. Great. Looks like there's another gray water related question. If it's not tied into actual planting, does the water just dump onto the ground? Well, the ordinance actually calls for the stub out, and I would assume that if you didn't have irrigated landscape, you wouldn't need to make that connection. I'm not sure Lynn or others could speak to that directly, but
Yes, there is a diagram about that, and it does require it to go out into mulch basins and not just go out onto the ground.
yeah, and I think there's some limitations if it's impractical due to construction or physical constraints or site or soil conditions
Yes.
as well. So it's yep, great, great.
And in
Uh,
terms of those, in terms of the native plants, and there's certainly credit in third-party like Greenpoint rated systems for having all native plants.
Great.
Let's see what's the next one.
Is there another one in there? Yeah.
Is there one?
Okay, let's see. Oh, a question about 2 shower heads and whether it's total GPM or GPM per valve.
Yeah, it's total.
Yeah,
Total.
it's well, yeah, it's definitely total. Um, yeah.
Or a valve that lets only one be on.
There's a question around address electrical tankless water heaters. Tankless water heaters allowed feasible due to impact to the energy code. So a tankless electric water heater tends to have a very high draw of amperage, so very high current draw in order to kind of be able to convert and make the hot water that's needed. If you have a space constraint and no gas available, that would be an instance where you would still have a high water need. That's where you would go to sort of a tankless, high volume tankless. There are point of use tankless water heaters that are electric that do have a place. When you're looking at the energy code, it's a lot of it is about trade-offs. And so you can use the point of use. It tends to show up more in commercial uses or in ADUs, for example. But you're not going to get the efficiency of an electric resistance tankless water heater. That's going to provide any real benefit to your overall energy performance. So where you have that situation, if you can put in a heat pump water heater tank system, that'll be your much more efficient solution. that'll have basically a 300% efficiency or 320% efficiency because it's moving heat rather than making heat. So it draws heat from the air. It's kind of like a refrigerator just operating in reverse. So, but if it's a space requirement issue and you have to go to tankless for an instantaneous hot water heating, anything that requires any real volume of water is going to be an electrical infrastructure issue, likely. And if not, it's going to kind of be a performance hit on your overall energy performance. Not sure if that answered the question or not. We have a few more minutes left.
Do you see any more questions there, Doug?
I don't offhand, but I may have missed a few. Let's see. Another one maybe on incentivizing battery storage for PV systems. Seems like the grid could benefit from battery storage systems. Sure, yeah. So again, this ties into the energy code. I'm sorry?
Yeah, it's funny because
Oh, looks like we're picking up some background noise. So in the current energy code, in the energy design rating, there is actually a provision where you get benefit of having energy storage. It counts as sort of an efficiency measure. So it shows up in your energy efficiency EDR. So that's kind of an incentive from the code standpoint. There are other statewide incentive programs on energy storage. The SGIP program does in fact include energy storage now. It will actually probably be including heat pump water heaters in the very near future as well. So the energy storage piece, though, about battery energy storage, I think that tends to be more like the kind of Tesla Powerwall type or the Sonnen energy systems that people have in their homes. That is, there are some statewide incentives. There's tax credits associated with it as well. So those would all apply. And then from a code standpoint, there are two aspects of it does provide energy efficiency benefit. And there, as of it was the kind of last code cycle on the fire side, there were some changes to the way we look at battery storage and the battery chemistry. So we used to look at it from a fire code standpoint based on the battery chemistry alone, and now we look at it based on the actual capacity of the battery. So it's a little bit easier from a fire code standpoint now to permit energy storage. So looking at it from a code perspective. Yeah. Let's see, anything else in there? Solar water heaters. Yeah. Great. So there's a question that says, what about solar water heaters? And I'm not sure. So there had been previously a solar water pre-plumbing. The general, I would say, industry is moving away from solar thermal, that they can get more productive use for a full year out of doing photovoltaics and doing an electric heat pump water heater. So from an overall value standpoint, industry is saying photovoltaics with heat pump water heating is far more efficient, but there is a place for solar water heating so solar thermal collectors preheating water for a gas-fired system, I guess. That is permittable, and it would have benefit under the energy code as well. And CalGreen is somewhat silent on that kind of technology, but the energy code does address it. It's allowable. Yeah. Great. We've got
and there were great incentives for solar thermal this last year. I don't know if they expired already.
Yeah, I think there may still be some available, although I'm not totally sure about that. Actually, that's a great question. Yeah. We've got maybe another minute. I don't see, looks like there's a comment in there, less than a question, but from some city staff about reviewing, design review, etc. Is there anything in there we've missed? I don't know if we did, but
Well, I don't think so. We're almost out of time here.
yeah.
So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. That was really great, Colleen and Doug. Thanks so much. And this will be linked on the Clean website, on City of Chula Vista Clean website. And I think it'll be available on the city YouTube channel. Is that right, Yasmin?
Yes, probably by the end of tomorrow, it will be available. And I will send an email to all participants with the link of recording and the slides.
Great.
Okay, that's great. And ICC CEUs will also be available for everyone that attended live today. I've captured your names here. So I will be, if you email me, I will send out the CEU number for you to use. So thanks very much, everyone. And please join us next time in November to take a look at non-residential.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. See you then.
See you then.